Historically, when comparing the German Navy with those of the French or English, Germany was never a true naval power. The naval laws passed by the Reichstag in 1898 and 1900 before the First World War, aimed at expanding the Imperial Navy, did not change much in this regard. With this, then Rear Admiral Alfred von Tirpitz wanted to secure a place in the sun for the German Empire under Kaiser Wilhelm II in relation to the other European great powers, in other words, to acquire colonies, as the Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs, Bernhard von Bülow, put it in 1897. When, in the First World War, on the 28th of August, 1914, the military favorite of Wilhelm II, the Imperial High Seas Fleet, clashed with the British fleet in the naval battle near Heligoland. Here you can see the light cruiser Mainz. It ended with a defeat and temporarily halted further operations against the British Grand Fleet. But even at the next serious encounter during the Battle of Doggerbank on January 24, 1915, in which, among other things, the large cruiser Blücher was sunk, the British remained victorious. Overall, during the first phase of the war, the Imperial Navy was only able to achieve one remarkable success when, on September 20, 1914, the German submarine U-9, under Kapitän-Leutnant Otto Weddingen, was able to sink 3 British armored cruisers in succession off the Hook of Holland. Weddingen was sunk on the 18th of March, 15, with his new submarine U-29 off Scotland after being rammed by the British battleship Dreadnought. As the war progressed, the Grey Wolves, as the submarine force was called, became a feared weapon on the world's oceans, in contrast to the surface units. In 3,274 missions by 320 boats, they sank 6,394 civilian and 100 warships, while 5,132 men of the submarine force fell and 200 submarines sank, or are still considered missing today. The most successful submarine commander in the First World War was the German Captain Lieutenant Lothar von Arnaud de la Perrière, with 194 sunk ships totaling 453,716 gross register tons, and at the same time also the most successful submarine commander in naval warfare history. Perrière died on the 1st of February 1941 as Vice Admiral in a plane crash near Le Bourget, close to Paris, and was buried at the Invalids Cemetery in Berlin. The greatest naval battle between the German High Seas Fleet and the British Grand Fleet occurred from the 31st of May to the 1st of June, 16, in the Battle of Jutland, with both sides afterwards claiming victory, but in fact neither side achieving its objectives. After that, the Imperial fleet hardly sailed anymore, out of fear of further losses, except for the submarines, and remained inactive in their ports, except for the successful amphibious operation Albion against Russia in September and October, 17, carried out together with the Army for the occupation of the Baltic islands of Dago, Moon, and Uzel. Among those who fell during the fighting was the 30-year-old Lieutenant Walter Flex, poet of the well-known poem Wild Geese Rush Through the Night. As for the Imperial Navy, it still sailed out a few times without encountering the enemy until, according to a fleet order on the 24th of October, 18, it was supposed to seek an honorable last battle quote rather than capitulate. However, this did not happen because in the meantime, a mutiny had broken out, mainly starting from Kiel and instigated by the later communist Karl Adelt and the Bavarian laborer Lothar Popp, who belonged to the Social Democratic Party of Germany. This was the so-called Kiel Sailors and Workers' Uprising. The sailors, many of whom had not seen much of the war until then, not to mention the workers who had been declared indispensable, had refused to set sail and instead decorated their ships with red cloths. Pop, who had not heard a shot in the war and was discharged as unfit for service in 1917, was celebrated after the Second World War, among others, by the comrades Schmidt and Gansel of the Social Democratic Party of Germany for having been the man who freed Germany from monarchy and the Kaiser. Why did I mention all this? Well, it's simply not enough to boldly establish a navy whose soldiers openly mutiny after just one generation of its existence in war, partly because there was a lack of tradition in every direction. For example, the British Navy had such a tradition, which had ruled the seas for centuries, and since April 1897 also applied very clear laws to end mutinies. But 6 months after the end of the war, the Imperial Navy did send one more signal when, according to Article 84 of the Treaty of Versailles, the German fleet was to be surrendered to Great Britain and was anchored in the Scottish Bay of Scapa Flow. On the 21st of June, 19, on the orders of Rear Admiral Ludwig von Reuter, 24 battleships, battle cruisers, and cruisers, as well as 50 torpedo boats, hoisted the war flag and sank themselves before the eyes of the then surprisingly and immensely angered English officers. Now, although the Imperial Navy had not covered itself in glory from a military standpoint, and had even openly mutinied in the end, there was, apart from the submarine force, one exception within it. The Marine Corps Flanders, which emerged from the Marine Division's Flanders on November 20, 1914. It was commanded for almost the entire duration of the war by Admiral Ludwig von Schröder. He was awarded the Prussian Pour le Mérite on October 20, 1915, and on December 23, 1917. He received the Oak Leaves, the Prussian Royal Order of the Crown, and the Prussian Order of the Red Eagle First Class with Oak Leaves. The picture shows the second class, second. He wore the Grand Cross of the Bavarian Military Merit Order with swords, the Saxon Grand Cross of the Albert Order with Golden Star and swords, and the Grand Cross of the Order of the Württemberg Crown with swords. Also, the man born as Ludwig Schröder was elevated to the hereditary Prussian nobility by the Prussian King Wilhelm II on February 17, 1912, and in 1917, the composer Theodor Krieghoff, who had once served under him as a vice sergeant, dedicated the Brummer March to him. Finally, there was the Admiral von Schröder Street across from the Bendler Block in Berlin, which in 1947 was renamed after the sailor Albin Kobus, who was executed in 1917 for mutiny, and it still bears his name today. These honors, such as naming streets after those who were sentenced to death by court-martial for refusing orders and mutiny, like Max Reich-Pitsch, who had been punished militarily 14 times before, were bestowed after the First World War by the same politicians who shed crocodile tears at memorial events for the 2 million fallen German soldiers. By the way, there are no other countries in the world besides Germany and Austria that let many of their military monuments decay, but build monuments to deserters and mutineers. Ludwig Schröder was born on July 17, 1854, as the son of a landowner in Hinsenkamp near Eggesen, and on May 31, 1871, he joined the Imperial Navy, which had been formed from the North German Confederation's Navy, as a cadet. After his training on the sailing training ship Niobe and the steam and sailing ship Gazelle, Schröder attended the Naval Academy and School in Kiel. He was then a company officer in the 1st Sailors Division, then on the armored frigate Deutschland, and then adjutant and signal officer on the battleship Kronprinz. After further years as a watch officer, instructor, teacher at the Naval Division at school, and first officer on a warship, he then spent 5.5 years as a torpedo instructor on the covered corvette Blücher until he returned to the torpedo and naval school as a teacher. Schröder then commanded various warships, served in the Imperial Naval Office from 1895, and was promoted to captain at sea on June 12, 1899. From April 1900 to the end of March 1901, he was director of the Naval School, also taught at the Naval Academy, was head of a department in the Admiralty staff of the Navy until September 1903, then commanded the armored cruiser Veneta, and until mid-March 1905 served as Commodore-in-Chief of the East American Cruiser Division. Promoted to Rear Admiral on March 14, 1905, he served as Inspector of Naval Artillery until the end of September. 1907 was then promoted to Vice Admiral in November, and became Chief of the 2nd Squadron of the High Seas Fleet, until he was appointed Chief of the Baltic Sea Naval Station and promoted to Admiral on January 27, 1911. Then, on the 6th of May, 1912, Schröder's request for retirement brought the incredibly diverse service of this high-ranking naval officer to an end, although he remained in the reserve, at that time referred to as placed at the disposal of the Navy. Admiral von Schröder, pictured here with the Marine Corps staff in Belgium, was certainly anything but a simple superior. He saw his life's mission solely in service to the Emperor and the fatherland. He was strict and hard on himself and others, and when necessary, he could also become angry. But once he had placed his trust in someone, he would stand up for them to the very end. And he never demanded anything that he didn't expect from himself. Lieutenant Commander Erich Edgar Schulze, who served in the Navy since 1914 and was Schröder's first Admiral Staff Officer from 1916, once characterized him as follows. He didn't like to beat around the bush or consider 1,000 possibilities and difficulties. His decisions came suddenly, as if from an unwavering soldierly instinct. He held on to it, his will determined the direction of his actions. So at times he often seemed rigid and one-sided. But his military knowledge was based on such a broad foundation that it made him adaptable to 1,000 different situations. His strategic views were based on in-depth geographical studies, on the exploration of general history, as well as specifically the military history of all eras, and on immersing himself in the characters of great army and fleet commanders of the past. Thus, his thoughts and decisions flowed from a broad stream of inner experience and knowledge, providing him with parallels for every new individual case. He mastered the technique of land warfare to a degree probably unmatched by anyone from the Navy. For him, there were no insignificant areas of military science, but only the one great idea of war, which aims at the destruction of the enemy. In doing so, Admiral von Schröder followed precisely the teachings of the important Prussian Major General, Army reformer, military scientist and ethicist Karl von Clausewitz, whose teachings are still taught today at the General Staff Academies of all armies. In addition, Schröder had what was attributed in the 17th century to the famous Dutch Admiral Michiel de Ruyter, namely that he could virtually smell coasts and shoals. And as Inspector of Naval Artillery from 1905 to 1907, Schröder made sure that people did not rely on the artificial firing procedures often practiced in peacetime, but instead trained in the procedures that would be used in combat. Schröder, who believed that a commander needed character rather than intelligence, demanded that his leaders always strive to impose their will on the enemy by getting as close to them as possible so that they could see the whites of their eyes. He had repeatedly impressed this upon those around him, especially when a subordinate seemed to him to be dependent on drill regulations or combat instructions, which today we would call rules. He would always add a quote, "You won't defeat the enemy with this red book." Of course, he had mastered all the regulations himself, but he let himself be governed by them all the less, knowing how much the two most significant European fleet commanders, the French Admiral Comte Pierre-André de Suffren de Saint-Tropez, and the Englishman Lord Horatio Nelson, the victor of the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805, had been hindered in their rise by fighting instructions. When the First World War began on the 1st of August 1914, and by the middle of the month, the German armies in France and Belgium had already made significant advances, it became necessary to secure the army's right flank by conquering the coast of Flanders. Based on this, Admiral von Tirpitz had given the order to form a naval corps, as this would greatly facilitate German naval warfare against England from Flanders. However, when the Admiralty planned to send Schröder, who had been reactivated at the beginning of the war, to Turkey as commander, von Tirpitz was able to push through his demand. Schröder belongs in Flanders. He then took up his assignment 5 weeks after the start of the war, on September 5, 1914 in Brussels, together with his general and admiral staff officers, securing the German Western Front against Antwerp, where around 80,000 Belgian soldiers had gathered in its massive fortress towers, supported by around 2,000 British naval infantrymen. In addition to parts of an army division, the 37th Landwehr Brigade, and several batteries of heavy field howitzers, Schröder was also given command of the Mobile Naval Division, with a strength of around 20,000 men. It had been formed on August 23, 1914 in Kiel from the 3 Sea battalions, as the infantry component of the German Navy is called, and naval reservists who, due to full staffing, could not be deployed either on warships or in coastal defense. The Mobile Naval Division under Admiral von Schröder existed until November 28 and was subordinate to Army Group Beseler, which had been formed on September 27, 1914, under the command of the General of the 3rd Reserve Corps, General of Infantry Hans von Beseler. It was divided into the Marine Infantry Brigade under Major General von Wichmann, the Marine Infantry Regiment No. 1 under Lieutenant Colonel von Lessing, the Marine Infantry Regiment No. 2 under Lieutenant Colonel von Goetze, the Sailor Artillery Brigade under Captain Herr, the Sailor Artillery Regiment No. 1 under Lieutenant Colonel Julius von Bernhut, the 2nd Sailor Artillery Regiment under Lieutenant Colonel von Obstfelder, the Mackensen Landwehr Eskadron, half of the Schwind Landwehr Eskadron, the 1st Landwehr Field Artillery Division, and the Landwehr Pioneer Company. And although most of Schröder's troops were not yet at full strength, those still arriving by train were transferred directly from the railway to their designated areas due to the enemy's overwhelming superiority. Over the course of the following months, these areas were expanded into a labyrinth of caves. Then, starting on August 20th, the Beseler Army Group began the siege of Antwerp, which ended with a German victory and, as seen here, with the occupation of the city by the Naval Division. They remained in Antwerp until October 21st, 1914, while Admiral von Schröder served as the governor of the city. Afterwards, it was transferred to the Flemish coast and placed under the command of Army High Command 4. During the siege and storming of Antwerp, Schröder's naval division was deployed as a so-called observation corps, which refers to a unit tasked with keeping an eye on a fortress or, during a siege, fighting off any enemy reserves that might approach. Schröder's chief of staff, Colonel Bernhard von Hülsen, who later became a lieutenant general in the Reichswehr, had assessed the performance of Schröder's observation corps after examining the enemy archives. If the German observation corps had been defeated, Brussels liberated, and the supply lines of the German right wing seriously disrupted, the unfortunate events on the Marne could have led to a catastrophe with unforeseeable consequences. With the event at the Marne, von Hülsen referred to 2 related circumstances. Firstly, the gap that had opened up between the attacking 1st and 2nd German armies during the first battle on the Marne, and secondly, the gloomy and pessimistic predictions made by the Royal Saxon Lieutenant Colonel Richard Hensch after his return from the headquarters of the First Army about the further course of the war. Hensch, the adjutant to the weak head of the German General Staff, Field Marshal Helmut von Moltke, had been jointly responsible for calling off the offensive. While the French later spoke of the miracle on the Marne, von Moltke, who had already suffered a nervous breakdown in the first weeks of the war, and, apart from his famous uncle Field Marshal Moltke the Elder's name, had little in common with him, was replaced on September 14, 1914, and died 2 years later. When, after the unfortunate course of the attack on the Marne in the west, which has just been described, a war of position ensued, the Supreme Army Command feared a possible British sea invasion from Flanders and ordered further reinforcements to this Belgian region. As a result, on November 8, 1914, the 2nd Naval Division was formed under Vice Admiral Friedrich Schultz, which was structured into the 3rd Naval Brigade under Rear Admiral Karl Wilbrand, with the Marine Regiment 3 and Sailor Regiment 3, the 4th Naval Brigade under Rear Admiral Karl Mariasch, with Sailor Regiments 4 and 5, the 3rd Landwehr Squadron, the 1st and 2nd Naval Field Batteries, and the 3rd Naval Pioneer Company. Here, in August 1916, Wilhelm II inspects the division. Of the approximately 20,000 men in the 2nd Marine Division, 4,000 were Marines, 2,000 were naval artillerymen, and 13,000 were naval reservists, who were members of the Naval Reserve and had been ordered to serve another 5 years in the Navy after 3 years of active duty and 4 years of reserve duty. Around 14,000 members of the 2nd Division came from the North Sea Naval Station, the rest from the Baltic Sea Naval Station. For the sake of completeness, it should also be mentioned that, on June 1, 1917, the 3rd Naval Division, which was directly subordinate to the Supreme Army Command, was established under Major General Conrad von Moltke, organized into 3 naval infantry regiments, parts of the Hussar Regiment No. 7, engineers, and field artillery. On November 15, 1914, the Mobile Naval Division and the 2nd Naval Division were combined to form the Marine Corps Flanders, still under the command of Admiral von Schröder, with the General Command's headquarters in Bruges until 1918. After the Mobile Naval Division was reorganized into the 1st Naval Division on November 29, the Marine Corps Flanders occupied the Belgian coast, which was armed with a series of batteries, built shelters and bunkers in the dunes, secured the coast, supported the army in fighting on the land front, provided border protection against Holland, guard and order units in the area assigned to the Marine Corps, and reinforced necessary naval or infantry personnel in other sectors of the Belgian front. They also buried their fallen soldiers here, who have since been reburied. In the beginning, the Marine Corps had a colorful mix of uniforms. The naval infantrymen wore the uniforms of the sea battalions, with the shako, while the sailors wore their blue or white uniforms, over which they would wear the 4th set, dyed field gray, for work. The Marines wore the uniforms of the naval battalions. With the Chaco, the sailors wore their blue or white uniforms, over which the field gray 4th uniform was worn for work. While the enlisted men continued to wear the round caps, there were naval peaked caps in field gray for the boatswains and officers. The operations room of the 2 naval divisions was set up in this way. The 1st Division secured the Antwerp Harbor Command and the Belgian coast up to the Dutch border. The 2nd Division covered the right flank of the army from Newport to Dixmude. In order to cover the entire width of the naval battle, Admiral von Schröder's Naval Corps had been assigned seaplanes, destroyers, torpedo boats, the Flanders minesweeper flotilla, and heavy coastal batteries. From 1915 onwards, von Schröder had the Flanders U-boat flotilla, established under corvette captain Karl Bartenbach. There was also a torpedo and destroyer fleet, and by the end of the war, the Flanders submarine flotilla was responsible for sinking a quarter of all British merchant ships, a total of 2,554. In June 1917, the Marine Corps had 4 naval air stations: the Naval Coastal Air Squadron with 4 squadrons, 2 Naval Coastal Protection Squadrons, and 2 remote control units, each with 2 remote-controlled boats that were 17 meters long and weighed 6 tons, essentially oversized surface torpedoes. Additionally, there were 2 Naval Field Fighter Squadrons, 3 naval balloon units, and 2 naval field aviation detachments. At the beginning of 1915, it was decided to develop the Flemish ports into real military bases. For example, around 14,000 people worked at the Imperial shipyard in the port of Bruges, including over 4,000 Belgian civilians. Together with the floating docks, the submarine bunkers were the most outstanding structures. Several submarine shelters were also built in Zeebrugge and Ostend, and new dry docks were constructed in Ostend. However, these military installations repeatedly led to bombardments by French or English aircraft. To give just one example, during the German occupation, around 6,000 bombs were dropped on Bruges, killing 123 civilians and injuring 243. About 700 houses were destroyed or severely damaged. The port itself was not even hit. However, on the night of April 23, 1918, the British Navy tried to destroy the mole at Zeebrugge, shown in blue, from the sea using a submarine loaded with explosives, shown in red, and then blocked the entrance and exit for submarines and other ships by sinking so-called block ships, marked in green, in the harbor entrance. The attack was carried out with 7 monitors, i.e., relatively small and slow warships designed for use in shallow waters but heavily armed, 6 cruisers, 7 destroyers, 33 motorboats, 18 small torpedo boats, 10 coastal motorboats, 5 block ships, 2 decommissioned submarines, each now loaded with 5 tons of explosives, and so on. When this massive fleet emerged from an artificially created wall of fog around midnight, it came under heavy fire from the German coastal batteries, which had been expecting such an operation for some time. But in addition to attempting to block the entrance, a battalion of British Marines and 200 Marines had landed at the entrance to the Bruges-Ostend Canal to destroy the German gun emplacement stationed there. However, as the German naval gunners were unable to fire their guns due to the close proximity of the attackers, most of the German sailors stationed there had been grouped into alarm units, which also succeeded in launching the decisive counterattack against the British landing forces that had disembarked. During this, the German torpedo boat sailor Hermann Kühne was killed after he had killed Wing Commander Frank Arthur Brock, who was armed with a revolver and a boarding knife in hand-to-hand combat with his own knife, but then also died from a stab wound inflicted by Brock. In doing so, however, Kühne had made a significant contribution to preventing the capture of the important pier battery. Although the British submarine U-3 had managed to damage the mole in Zeebrugge with an explosion, and 2 block ships had been sunk, the engineers of the Marine Corps simply dug a channel around the block ships that were lying too far out, so that already the next day, the submarines were able to use the entrance and exit again at high tide. During the blocking attack on Zeebrugge, the protected cruiser Vindictive was severely damaged. 227 British soldiers were killed and 356 wounded, compared to 8 German soldiers killed and 16 wounded. And the second attempt to block the port of Ostend on the night of May 9th to 10th, 1918, in which His Majesty's ship Vindictive was finally sunk, was also repelled. The British had 8 killed, 10 missing, and 29 wounded, while on the German side, 3 soldiers were killed and 8 wounded. On October 16, 1918, the now 64-year-old Admiral von Schröder issued his last daily order. On orders from the Supreme Army Command, the Marine Corps will vacate its current combat positions and be led to new lines of resistance. The Marine Corps has held the Flemish coast and the adjacent land fronts for 4 years without giving up an inch of ground. It has fully accomplished its task of serving as flank protection for the armies on our Western Front. I remember the naval forces with high and grateful recognition. Inspired by a spirit of sacrifice and attack, they were the terror of our enemies for many years, far out into the open seas. They upheld the honor of the flag until the very last day. During the years of fighting, Admiral von Schröder had earned himself the nickname Lion of Flanders. When the war was drawing to a close and parts of his naval corps had been transferred to the Baltic Sea, he was ordered by the Admiralty to take action against the mutinous sailors in Kiel. However, the government formed on October 3, 1918, under the new Chancellor Max von Baden, opposed these measures, and so they were not carried out. Schröder then commanded the corps until December 12, 1918, and was finally discharged from the army. Shortly afterwards, the Central Council of the Navy, which was planning a socialist republic, as reported here in an article from the Social Democratic newspaper Voorwärts, demanded the arrest of, among others, Schröder on charges of murder. Ludwig von Schröder had been married to Anna née Lemke since October 25, 1881, and had 5 children, including his son Ludwig, who died on July 28, 1941, as a general of anti-aircraft artillery in the Hohenlohe Hospital from his injuries after a plane crash near Belgrade. Here are 3 generations of the Schröder family, the Admiral with his son Ludwig and grandson Ludwig. On September 13, 1921, von Schröder, together with the Comradeship Association of the Marine Corps Flanders, established the Honor and Commemorative Cross of the Marine Corps Flanders, called the Flanders Cross. The Weimar Republic government refused Belgium's request to extradite the Admiral. Later, from 1925 to 1931, he was the first chairman of the National Association of German Officers. Retired Admiral Ludwig von Schröder died on the 23rd of July, 1933 in Berlin-Hollensee and was buried with a state funeral at the Invalidenfriedhof Cemetery in Berlin.